Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm one of those folks who, when I left high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in college, so I did everything. I did an English degree, I did a biology degree, I did honors papers in butterflies, I did an honor paper in spiders. And then I looked at graduate school and I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I applied to creative writing programs and I applied to entomology programs and I applied to botany programs. Basically, I wanted to get as far away from the Ozarks as I could. That's where I grew up. And because, it was the Ozarks and we were pretty much dirt poor, I wanted the best ride I could get because I'd gotten really good scholarship rides as an undergraduate at Southeast Missouri State. So I ended up here at the University of Maryland, where I worked for a number of years, slaved away on my master's program in entomology, but was eventually lured into on the dark side of science communication and science writing. And I've been a science communication, science policy, science public affairs person for most of my career, and I just retired at the end of 2023 from about 40 years of government service in public affairs and science. 7 federal agencies, a couple of research universities, White House, Congress. It's been a great ride. But all along, I've had the opportunity to continue studying butterflies. And I have, it's not like that's the only thing I study. I also study mosses. I do a lot of botany stuff. I just came back from a week-long visit in Texas doing birding, and I'm an active birder, an active bird lister. But I don't really twitch the way a lot of folks do for birds and for butterflies and things like that. And that's one of the things that I want to sort of preface what I'm about to say here in this MD 100, the Big Year project. When people do a birding big year, the reality is it's a competitive thing for the most part. It's good for the soul, no question. It's an exciting thing to do. You don't contribute much to science from a birding big year. I would say that the MD 100, however, contributed a great deal to our understanding of the phenology and the distribution and even the abundance of various species here in Maryland. And our understanding, if we knew now what we did in 2013, 10 years ago, we would have had a much more robust big year, I swear. And this just sets the bar so much lower for the rest of you to do a better job of meeting that record. Tom and I, every year we wonder, is someone going to take up the mantle and try to get a MD 106, MD 107? And I'll tell you a little bit about how one can do that and what I think the real standard ought to be going forward. With that, I think I'll go ahead, Matt, and share my slides.
Sounds good.
And make sure everyone can see those. Everybody good?
Yep. Looks good over here.
All right. So the talk that I wanted to do here was that you too can do a butterfly big year, and you can, and it doesn't have to be a Maryland big year. It could be a county big year. It could be a town big year. It could be your backyard big year. But I just want to make sure that everyone understands you can do a butterfly big year anywhere, anytime. You set your own rules. And that's really what this is all about, is setting your own rules and creating a butterfly big year. So really, what is a big year when we get right down to it? Most of us, as Matt says, think about this as what we see in the birding world. It's how many birds can you see in a given area, the whole world, United States, the American Birding Association area. How many can you see between January 1st and December 31st? For some people, it's how many can you see in your state. For some, it's how many can you see in your county. For some, it's how many can you see on a bicycle, how many can you see on a train. It's always time constrained. So a birding big year is just that. It's a year. It's usually geography constrained, but that geography can change wherever you want it to be. And it usually has some special rules. So for example, some of the big years in birding, you're not allowed to count birds that got hit by cars, and you see the carcass. You're not allowed to count herd only birds that you didn't actually see, but you were identifying from your from their call or from their song. We had some of those as well, and I'll talk a little bit about what our special rules were. As soon as I can make this go forward, there we go. So the origin of our big year in 2013, some of you who are birders may remember that 2013 was also an eruptive year for crossbills and for redpolls and for a lot of other winter finches because the crop in Canada was so poor. So 2013, I was out on January 6th. It was a day very much like we're probably going to have this weekend. We'd had a snow, it'd gotten pretty cold already a couple times, and snow had melted, but the crossbills were being seen out in Patuxent North Tract on the reservation North Tract. And darned if I didn't see, sitting there in, nectaring on a dandelion, an American painted lady. Now that's just incredible that I would see such a thing in January. And I thought this must be an omen, and it must be an omen that we should do a butterfly big year. Because Tom and I and Beth Johnson, our other collaborator, had all sort of been thinking about this for some time, that we didn't know enough about Maryland butterflies, and the butterfly big year would be the year to do it. And this really was what jump-started our thinking and concerns about our big year. So we started doing research for January and February, and then we launched on Leplog. And Leplog is the blog space that I work on and maintain, that has a lot of the Maryland butterfly records, a lot of the basic data stuff about butterflies. And I have been less than enthusiastic recently about continuing to post stuff, but I'll be getting back to that too. I've been suffering the withdrawal of being a working stiff, and you think you want to do all these things immediately and just completely do all these wonderful things you didn't get a chance to do when you're working, but really what you want to do is sleep. So I will get back to that eventually, but it's been a great couple of napping months at this point. But in March of 2013 on Leplog, we announced that we had decided to log 100 or more species in Maryland, and I'll get into what that means, why that number was special, what's sacred about that. We thought at the time that this was just at the edges of being doable, and it would take a lot of travel, it would take a lot of planning, and it would take a lot of spending time in places where we had not often been, and scouring databases and reference works for that kind of stuff about where to find those difficult species. So what we were looking for was the highest number of butterfly species we could see in Maryland or DC. We added DC to this primarily so we could spend time at the National Arboretum, which is one of the few places that has really high butterfly diversity in the district, as well as Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. It would be during the calendar year 2013. We would include any life stage, but it turns out they were all adults. We would include verifiable roadkill. Turns out we didn't have any roadkill that we didn't see live either. Photo documentation was helpful, but not required. So we worked on the honor system that if we said we saw black dash in Garrett County, people would believe we saw black dash in Garrett County. Although we did get photographs of almost everything we saw. We did not collect as part of the MD100 project. We did collect azures that year because their distribution was not very well known, and we were sharing those specimens with the folks who were working on the taxonomy of that group. And ideally, we would share at the time of the sighting, and this was, keep in mind, in the before times, before iNaturalist, before the Maryland Biodiversity Project. That sharing was on Leplog, on local listservs, and email phone trees, and some of you remember those days and helped us find these things quite well. And this is the team. This is Tom Stock on the left and Beth Johnson standing in front, and they are photographing a great purple hair streak. For them, I'd already gotten it at that point, but for them, this was at Hickory Point near Pocomoke City. This was the first one that they had seen that year, so they were able to get it on their lists. Beth never got quite as many butterflies as we did, but she was a trooper and she was helpful, particularly in getting us on a number of unusual plants that we knew were, she is active in the Maryland Native Plant Society. and helped us get on plants that we knew we needed to find as host plants to be able to find the butterflies they fed on. And our goal was 100 species in calendar 2023 or 2013. So why did we decide 100 was the good goal? So here's how we explain it on Leplog. So if you look at it, give or take, Maryland has it's actually 159 records of butterflies and skippers. So we've expanded that a little bit since we wrote this on Leplog. But it turns out that that's a really unlikely number that anyone will ever reach, because some of them don't occur in Maryland anymore, like Regal fritillary. Some of them are very restricted to extremely rare habitats like bog copper and mulberry ring. And the rest of the 150, many of them are accidentals, one-time wonders, strays from their normal range. And you cut into that 150 pretty substantially. So when we did the analysis, I also went back, I just have to say here, even though we know a lot about the butterflies of Maryland and the District of Columbia, they have not been formally atlased, formally understood since the 30s, when Austin Clark did his famous Butterflies of the District of Columbia and Vicinity. And it's available online, and I recommend anyone taking a look at that, particularly if you're living in the district, to see where some of these cool things were and what's become of their habitat. I also spent a lot of time in the state collection at the university and at the Smithsonian, where a lot of our local butterflies are kept, folks who've been collecting there for a long time, and with a number of private collectors, just to see where they'd been collected and what we've been able to see. And this was all part of our lead up to March, so that we would know what we were looking for. We decided Maryland. So at one point we thought, well, we could do a big year in Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And that had its appeal. But we decided we would stick with Maryland because Maryland Biodiversity Project was just getting started. We thought it would be a really useful adjunct to MVP. Maryland itself, as you all know, is ecologically really quite diverse. It's also compact. It's the 9th smallest state in the union. We have relatively well-known lep fauna, but it hasn't been surveyed in a formal way for a long time. And I think probably more than anything else, Tom lived in Silver Spring at the time, so did Beth. I lived in College Park, and everything was within a 2.5-hour drive of us, anywhere within the state to be able to suss them out. The state itself, as you notice, is very diverse. We have a lot of boreal relicts in the western part of the state. We have a lot of southern butterflies and Delmarva. We have a number of butterflies that, are historically difficult to find in each of these provinces. And so we knew we had a really good chance, knowing as much as we did about the geophysical aspects of Maryland, to be able to find the things that we were going to be looking for. We knew this was going to be a very rich place to be. So here's where our math started. And this is, big years are always a game of math and what's possible, what you've missed, what you're still looking forward to. And this is where we all started. So of that 159 that we know have been recorded in Maryland, about 13 of them are one-time wonders. They've shown up once, maybe twice. Things like the queen, relative of the monarch that showed up after a hurricane over on the Eastern Shore. There are 15 that are probably no longer with us. Chermock's mulberry wing, for example, may be, unfortunately, may be extinct rather than just extirpated, but it's almost certainly extirpated from Maryland. Diana fritillary, Hessel's hairstreak, all those as well. Then there's a couple that you see once every 5 years or so. Dainty sulfur. Some of you may remember that, a couple of years ago, there was a big eruption of dainty sulfur, and those dainty sulfurs didn't survive the winter. And so you need some sort of forcing event. Turns out that forcing event was a drought in the with that hay came dainty sulfurs, and they were able to get a couple of broods in before they succumbed to the winter. And then there are, 21 or so that are exceedingly rare or highly local, things like hoary edge. which we only know from one place. Bog copper, we only know from one place. King's hair streak, very, very local host plant. Edward's hair streak, very, very local habitat. And that left us with more or less 107 thereabouts, many of which even then are uncommon, local, or have very restricted flight periods. And that's the other thing that differentiates the butterfly big year from a birding big year. Birds can show up anywhere. Butterflies, not so much. Many of them are very restricted to habitats. And if you miss their spring flight, they're not coming back through in the fall. You've missed it. Many of our butterflies are univoltine. They only fly once during the year. And even the ones that have more than one brood are not always that common or in that kind of a very common habitat. So that's where we are. 107, give or take. And we had some investments we had to make. My biggest investment was a new car, and that has served us well. I was driving a Prius up until then, and had I been driving a Prius in 2013 for the big year, I'd have had probably half the butterflies that I ended up getting, because we had some really serious back roads to figure out. A lot of advanced planning to keep us on track, and we decided that 100 was where we would make it, so we called this the Maryland 100. We figured that there was a stretch goal, 100 species in Maryland out of about 107 that we thought were doable. MD 100 would be really a stretch goal for us. And to do that, we knew that we had to, by the time Memorial Day comes around, we had to be halfway to our target already, 50 species already by then. Many of them fly only in the spring. We had to have gotten all of those. We needed to get to at least 75 by mid-June. We needed to have 90 by mid-July, and to be certain of reaching the MD 100 goal, we thought we couldn't count on fall specialties and migrants, because you never know if you're going to find those specialties or if you're going to have a good migrant year. We did not, in fact, have a good migrant year in 2013. That, we need to have things pretty much wrapped up by August, because you couldn't count on the rest of these things. So that's what we were planning. We were ticking down the days. We had week goals. We had month goals. We kept a living ticker spreadsheet on the site so people could watch us, what we were doing, where we were going. We routinely posted all of our sightings as soon as we did. People were very helpful to us. They would let us know when they'd seen things. There were a couple of other folks who were sort of keeping track as well. We also found out that a lot of people were following us. We would find interesting things on our big year. We would post them, and the next week people would have been posting from the same place because they'd seen us being there first. And you start with sort of what are your must-haves? What do you have to have? So to reach MD 100, we had to have some early spring species, early spring specialties. For example, we had to have silvery blue, and that's what's in the picture here, Olympia marble, maybe tortoiseshells. We didn't get any tortoiseshells in 2013. And those mostly are going to come from Green Ridge State Forest in Allegheny County. We needed West Virginia white, pepper and salt skipper in Garrett County. We needed frosted elfin in King's hair streak on the Lower Eastern Shore, and we needed brown elfin either in Frederick Watershed or Wacomico County. There were two places we could have seen that there. We ended up with it in Frederick Watershed, looking at one of the places that Kathy Barilski, who's on here tonight, turned us on to. So in point of fact, 2013 was not going to be the best year possible to do a butterfly big year, because it started really, really late. Despite the fact that we had that great American lady in January, it was a very slow spring. Nothing showed up until the very last week of March. And as many of you know, we expect to see our angle wings, morning cloaks, comma, question mark, and even early spring brood of summer azure in March, easily in March, maybe even falcate orange tips in March. Tom and I both had cabbage white, and I had morning cloak and spring azure, but that was it. I mean, at the end of March, we had not seen a whole heck of a lot yet. And these are morning cloaks doing exactly what I suggested a little earlier they would be doing. They're feeding on sap from a broken limb that was bleeding out of a wound in a tree early in the spring. April really opens up the univoltine species that you've got to get if you're going to have a big year. Many of our butterflies have only one flight. Many of them are one flights only in the spring. We only have a handful of butterflies that have univoltine flights in the fall. We have a couple that have univoltine flights in the middle of the summer. But to get here, the plan called for hitting the eastern shore often and early to track the kind of things you need to see there. The azures, the skippers, the elfins, and some of the univoltine skippers, and then turn to Green Ridge State Forest for Olympia marble and other Western Maryland specialties. The thinking at that time being that, Green Ridge would be slow to warm up and be warmer on the eastern shore, so we should try to catch all the things on the eastern shore we could and then turn our attention to Green Ridge. What we now know as a consequence, both of the Maryland 100 big year and the work we've done since, is that's really not true. Green Ridge has some of the earliest butterflies in the state because of those west-facing shale barren slopes that get very warm. It can sometimes be 90 degrees there in March and April. And a lot of these univoltines come out to take advantage to thermoregulate along those shale barrens. Now, I got some of the early ones pretty easily. I got falcate orange tip, comma, question mark, and a couple of the Green Ridge specialties. We still had to do a couple of major field trips. We had to start down to the eastern shore a couple of times, back to Green Ridge a couple of times. It was already a slog. April was a very, very busy month for us. The highlights for April, of course, were two places in particular. Tom Tyler Nature Trail along the Nanticoke River. And if you've never been to Tom Tyler, it's near Mardella Springs, near Vienna. It's a terrific place to go to catch a couple of the really interesting early birds. The Henry's elfin, brown elfin sometimes, pine elfin sometimes, holly azure, and some other things that you just don't normally see flying there. And I had been surveying that area for a long time, thinking that we might find the state record of Hessel's hairstreak there. Turns out, I think it's an error that we ever had Hessel's hairstreak in Maryland in the first place. The error dates back to a Hessel's hairstreak actually collected in Delaware and mixed up with some specimens in Maryland. That's the only record of Hessel's hairstreak we have. The other place that I would not normally have thought of as being a really butterfly-rich area is Merkel Wildlife Management Area. And Merkel, for those of you who know the Patuxent River State Park, there's a wildlife drive that on Sundays in the season drives all the way down through Jug Bay, all the way up then into Merkel Wildlife Management Area. And you can get a lot of cool things along that drive. All the anglewings, you can often get snout there. You can get the other azures there, including holly azure. Just a lot of things show up there. And in particular, you get juniper hairstreak. That was one of the things we were looking for. There's a particular juniper, eastern red cedar, on a particular part of that road that is the first place that juniper hairstreaks show up in the state of Maryland, as far as I know. We got all the common azures there. We got spring azure. We got the newly described holly azure. We got all the easy whites and all the sulfurs, all the early common swallowtails. I got to tell you, we were feeling pretty pumped about getting to MD 100. But if you're looking at the rest of the univoltines, we cleaned up on them too. Keep going. By the end of April, we were pushing about 30 species. But we already had this nagging doubt. There were some things that we had not seen yet that we thought we should have been seeing. We thought we would have seen Olympia marble at that point. It's usually an early flyer. We had missed frosted elfin, which we thought was an earlier flyer than it actually turns out to be, despite 3 trips that I made down to Nassawango just to see this butterfly that you see here on lupin, its host plant now. Both of these could be potentially fatal. At this point, anything you miss is potentially fatal to making, since the margin is so slim, it's potentially fatal to making MD 100. But then May was just fantastic. It would require, though, getting to 50, by the end of the month, which was our plan, crisscrossing the state 5 different times, from Soldier's Delight back again to Nassawango twice, to Garrett County twice, to Green Ridge State Forest 3 times, to Queen Anne's County several times. And really, we were bolstered by an incredibly epic day in Green Ridge State Forest. Now I know that there are epic days possible every year in Green Ridge State Forest, now that we know where to look for things. Olympia marble, silvery blue, an unexpected, at that time, cobweb skipper. We now know they're very common there, or relatively common there. Northern cloudy wing, and all the dusky wings you could want, sleepy dusky wing, dreamy dusky wing, and all the others, juveniles, and all of those. So May treated us really, really well. And we did, in fact, get to 50 by the end of May. But we had dipped on West Virginia white. We had dipped on pepper and salt skipper. We had dipped on cherry gull azure. And it was already getting late in the season, we thought, for Appalachian tiger swallowtail and Appalachian azure. Turns out, as we did our MD 100, Appalachian tiger swallowtail flies much later than anyone thought it was flying. Appalachian azure flies well into June, sometimes toward the end of June, depending on where you are. So a lot of the good information that comes out of MD 100 really had to do with, when do these things actually fly? And remember, this is before iNaturalist, so we were not seeing any phenograms. We were not seeing where things were flying. We were not seeing people reporting things. This was all based on basically Dick Smith's work. And a few, going back through issues of the Maryland Entomologist, and looking at different other references that we had, which really weren't all that helpful. This is the West Virginia white that we never saw. We did have a couple of May standouts at Soldier's Delight, which has really 2 seasons for butterflies. There's an early season where you can get dusted skipper and cobweb skipper. You can only see them in the spring. And then you'd have to go back there in August to see Leonard skipper. It's the only easy place to see that in the state of Maryland. At that time, it was the only place. We now know there are a number of other places. There were amazing brown elfin numbers and white M hair streaks that spring in Frederick Municipal Forest. And we had early appearances of things we sometimes don't see at all, or didn't at that time. Common roadside skipper, which is in the slide here. Sleepy orange, which at that time showed up for us as a midsummer specialty, if it showed up at all. Now it's a common overwintering butterfly that actually you can find from the end of March, early April, through the rest of the summer. And meadow fritillary, which we now know. We thought it was double brooded. It's now at least triple brooded, maybe even 4 broods in Maryland. But then June comes. June was really hot. I got to tell you, June 2013 was a miserable year, miserable month. We had to have a couple of things that month to keep us on track, things we wouldn't be able to find anyplace else. We had to have mulberry wing, not Chermock's mulberry wing. We sort of had given up on that already, but on the nominate species, mulberry wing, the only place in the state really, there are a couple of bogs, but only one that delivers really good numbers, and that's in Montgomery County. We had to have silver bordered fritillary, and that's what's shown here in the slide. We had to have Harris's hair streak, and both of those really you can only get in Garrett County. So the plan for June is shaping up this way. First priority was mopping up our misses, Appalachian azure and Appalachian tiger swallowtail. We got both of those. Terrific. Our second priority was univoltine skippers like mulberry wing. We got that on the Western Montgomery County annual butterfly count, summer butterfly count. Indian skipper and hobbamoke skipper, picked both of those up in the Frederick watershed area. And our third priority were hair streaks. Those of you who follow hair streaks know that June is hair streak month. They start usually around Memorial Day, and for the most part, many of them, the univoltine ones, all the Satyrium hair streaks are done by the end of June. And if you miss them, you miss them. It's the unusual case, things like gray hair streak, that are pretty much seen all summer long, but then they're multi-bolting. They keep popping out broods all the time. But most of the hair streaks we were interested in really have only one one univoltine flight, and that would have been in the middle of June. We lucked into a really terrific spot that really had not been butterflied before. We couldn't find any records of it in Charles County, little place called Friendship Landing. And I will tell you that the dogbane patch I'm going to tell you about now is gone. The milkweed there is gone. It doesn't compete very well with normal pasture management and mowing, and they just let the place grow up. And neither dogbane nor milkweed competes very well with the fescue that they were planting there. But when we went in 2013, in June, we were there on Tom's birthday. We had in a patch the size maybe 2 acres, maybe 3 acres, 150 banded hair streaks, more hair streaks than I had ever seen in my life up to then. Everywhere, interesting skippers, great swallowtails. It was terrific. And this little excerpt here is from Tom's narrative, which is on the left log as well, Tom's MD 100 narrative. And June really did deliver for us. So by the end of June, we'd been lucky, I have to say that, but we'd also been persevering. We got great purple hair streak, which some of you may know feeds only on mistletoe. And it probably is not as uncommon as we think it is. And this gets back to a question was asked earlier in the discussion. Are butterflies less common than they were? I think a lot of times we look at species like great purple hair streak. Feeds on mistletoe, restricted to Delmarva, we think. Might be some in Northern Virginia, but mostly Delmarva. And we know that it used to be much more commonly observed. And that's the critical thing here. It was commonly observed because the mowing regime on the roads, back roads in Dorchester County and Wycomico County and Worcester County, they were allowed to grow up, and there was a lot of nectar. And so all you had to do was stop on the shoulder and you would see all these great butterflies. If you could drive down there now, it looks like every single road has been turned into a golf course meadow. They're completely mowed to the ground. For the most part, it's a jobs program for the counties. They have a lot of interest in keeping those jobs available. It's combined with the problem of a lot of herbicide use in the agricultural area. So we're used to have the verge between a field and the roadside. That's all gone now. And you don't have, weedy fields anymore. So finding great purple hair streak was relatively easy for us, but it's harder and harder to see now, even though I don't think it's less common. I just think that they're nectaring someplace besides sitting on roadsides where you can see them easily. We also picked up Appalachian tiger swallowtail, mulberry wing, Edwards hair streak, and rare skipper, which is, as its name suggests, rare, in Dorchester County, and a bunch of other really good skippers in Kent County at the Eastern Neck National Wildlife Refuge. And if you have a really great summer destination for butterflies, Eastern Neck's Butterfly Garden is terrific, particularly the first 2 weeks of June when the buttonbush is blooming. They have a whole hedgerow of buttonbushes there. You can pick up 30 butterfly species easily in a day. Let's see what's happening. There we go. But I got to tell you, end of June, we were dog tired. The Eastern Shore was hot and muggy. I-68 was a nightmare. I mean, there were people driving, I-68 was just a rolling parking lot if there weren't, even if there weren't any accidents along there. The Bay Bridge was clogged with shorebound beachgoers. So we sort of had to beg the indulgence of our respective employers. And we were both, Tom and I, both fully employed at the time, to do some weekday stuff so we would miss most of the beach traffic and the mountain traffic. But we were frankly really tired. We needed King's hair streak, and I would spend 5 trips to Worcester County just for that butterfly. Tom actually never got it that year. I didn't go. He didn't come with me for all those trips, but he dipped on it for the year. We still needed bronze copper, a very uncommon butterfly on the eastern shore. We needed northern metal mark from Allegheny County, and we needed Aphrodite and Atlantis fritillaries from Garrett County. I mean, so you see what's happening now. We're doing one weekend in Garrett County, one weekend on Delmarva, one weekend in Garrett County, one weekend in Delmarva. It was tiring. And oops, let me see if I can go back. Oh, there we go. A lot of, and this is true of anyone who does big years, no matter what the plant, animal species is. New butterflies are increasingly hard to come by as you get closer to your big numbers, right? Where we had in April and May, 20 or 30 species a month, July gave us fewer than 10, and we had to work twice as hard for those 10 than we had previously. We did, however, get a coup with bog copper. So many of you know, if you know butterflies at all in Maryland, you know that there's one place to go for bog copper, and that's Cranesville Swamp, which is terrific. But the part of Cranesville Swamp where the bog coppers are is actually in West Virginia. We had to go into an unexplored, or at least an underexplored glade area to find bog coppers, or try to find bog coppers in Maryland rather than in West Virginia. We were able to engage Fran Pope, just a terrific butterflyer from Garrett County, who led us out on a number of trips, one of which got us black dash and silver bordered fritillary and some other things that we really would not have been able to find anywhere else. The slog through the bog was just terrific, and Tom again waxed ecstatic here in his narrative was the glades. It's a cranberry bog system tucked away into a nature conservancy property near Deep Creek Lake. It's just amazing, and we were actually able to find what at that time was considered to be the only extant populations of bog copper in Western Maryland. I've now discovered a good number of other sites, smaller bogs, so it can be found. They're very difficult to find, but still the best place to see them, if you don't care about what county they're in or what state they're in, is to go to Cranesville and walk out in the bog boardwalk. So for me, July was a sweet spot. July finally got me to 100 with King's Hair Streak on my 5th drive to Dorchester County. A solo trip to Pocomoke City got me Palamedes swallowtail. That's the only place in Maryland that it occurs. Another solo to Jug Bay got me southern cloudy wing. So I was at my 100. I was very excited. Tom was not quite so excited because he wasn't quite there yet. August, on the other hand, was the worst month ever. I did not see a single new butterfly. Tom saw Ocola skipper, and at that time, Ocola skippers were unusual to see in the fall here. Now it's one of our more common migrant butterflies in late fall. You can see them with regularity, almost any, weedy field that you choose to inspect in late August, early September. And then we came back with a vengeance in September. Everyone has what they consider a nemesis critter. And for me, it was painted lady, sometimes called the cosmopolitan, which just rubs salt in the wound because it's supposed to be so common that it's everywhere and you can't miss it. I did not see a painted lady all year long until I finally got it in September. Tom got a couple of species he'd been missing, and then we went to Soldier's Delight for the rare and very local Leonard skipper. At that time, that was the only place it was known from. We now know it from a couple of other sites of all places, Western Maryland, in Garrett County. And then our grand finale, Tom and Beth both got their Palamedes swallowtail lifers. And the best surprise was our bronze copper, which we found finally on Columbus Day, or Indigenous Peoples Day, in October for species 105 for me. And I was over the moon. because that really, just anything over, to have reached 100 was more than we were expecting. And to actually be able to get to 105 was just amazing to me and to many of the friends who've been following us. Now, the highlights for this, I logged, just me, and Tom and Beth did their own travel too. I logged just shy of 18,000 miles hunting butterflies in 2013. That's a lot. I had 47 field days of effort. That's just me. It's not Tom and it's not Beth. And all of us while holding down a full-time job. I had my 105, Tom had 102. We won't embarrass Beth by telling how many she had, but it wasn't nearly that many. But we also had really great familiarity with Maryland diners and drive-throughs and dives. And again, I just can't stress enough that because they're not as well studied as butterflies, and because of the way we went about this, there were a number of contributions to butterfly population dynamics, phenology, and distribution that you can do in a butterfly big year, as we did in the MD 100 year. Now, if I were going to do this big year again in 2024, not saying that I would, but if I were, I think my stretch goal would actually be 115. And that's due to a couple of different things. One is I would have the ability to use iNaturalist in Facebook posts where people are reporting things that we missed out on and dipped on things. And my understanding of their phenology and their biology is so much better. We'd still have to pray for clement weather. We'd still have to pray for eruptive species, but there are a number more, and they seem to erupt more frequently than they used to. And there are a number of species that are now beginning to make their way into Maryland that we really weren't seeing then. I suspect in 2024, we'll have gem satyr confirmed, for example, as a breeding species in Maryland, probably in the Western County. It could occur in Garrett County, or it could occur on the Eastern Shore, same way that Carolina satyr did. And if I were going to do a big year in 2024, I would retire. Well, guess what, folks? I retired. What do you need to do if you want to plan your own big year? And Tom and Beth and I all hope that our record gets broken. Honest to God, we do. It gives us great pleasure every year to note that nobody else has broken that yet. That's because none of them are as stupid and as crazy as we were trying to do this. But I really hope that there will be a challenge now for people to do this. You need to decide your own geographic limits and set your own special rules. I cannot tell you how much research you have to do in advance and how much planning you have to do, setting your goals week by week by week, just being really hard about which butterflies you need to see when. You've got to have some flexibility in your job. You need to be able to do some weekday excursions if the weather doesn't cooperate. This last year, in 2023, if I'd been doing a butterfly big year, every weekend was rain. Every single weekend was rain. Do take advantage of annual butterfly counts that are in your area, and there are a number in Maryland if that's where you're going to be doing it. And the other thing is let other people know that you're doing it. People who do birding big years keep it a real secret so that they don't get more competition. You won't get a good butterfly big year unless let people know what you're looking for and let them help you find the things that you're looking for. And we got such great support from so many members of the butterfly community in Maryland. It was just terrific. What do you need? You don't need a lot. You don't need expensive kit. You don't need all these things. You can spend a lot of money doing butterfly work, but you don't need it. Your major expenses are going to be gas and food, and occasionally a hotel overnight if you're doing far-flung destinations and staying 2 days because you don't know what the weather's going to be like. You will need a net, and some species you are just not going to be able to identify unless they're in hand, unless you have a really good look at them. So you will need to have a net. You need to have permethrin, every place, or some sort of insect repellent. We recommend permethrin because you can, do it and forget it, and you don't end up having, oh, I forgot to put my spray on, and so I have 10,000 seed ticks on me. Sunscreen, got to have sunscreen. And I don't think you have to have a camera, but in this day and age, it's almost a requirement that you have a point and shoot camera at least to be able to document. And coffee, lots and lots and lots of coffee. Having said that, I wish everyone really, really, really good luck on their butterfly big year. I think it would be terrific if all of you did some version of a big year, whether it's your quad or your county or something like that, because so much needs to be documented still about butterflies. And we have iNat now that you can just submit your records to. They automatically go into Maryland Biodiversity Project, which spits out these great phenograms for you to look at to see where you've been seeing the butterfly, when it's flying, all those kinds of things. And you have other resources. You have our leplog, and that's the address there, wordpress.leplog.com, and the MD Loads Google group that I maintain. And they'll both be useful resources if you decide to do a butterfly big year. I will stop there and I will stop sharing so that we may entertain some interesting conversations.
Wonderful. Let me just quickly point out that for those, if you're not familiar with iNaturalist and you want to know more about it, we had a presentation at the club last year, and it was posted to our YouTube account, so you can find that there. It was Joe DeMoya from, I think he works in the Everglades, who did an in-depth demo of how iNaturalist works. I learned that the website is much better than the app you get on your phone, which has fairly limited functionalities. So check that out. You can find it on our YouTube channel, and it's a really useful tool. And I think several people who are here today were at that, so they can maybe vouch for that. Thank you, Rick. Awesome.
And those of you who follow Maryland Biodiversity Project know that they just launched a new website as well. Much better, much easier to use on your iPhone actually now than it was, and much easier to search and much easier to use. It's just a terrific site to use now.
All right, what questions do we all have?
Rick, this is Bob Gardner here. I had a couple quick questions for you. First of all, thank you for a very nice and informative presentation, but I had two quick questions. When you said Harris's Hair Street, did you mean Harris's Checker Spot?
I meant Harris's checker spot. Yes, I
Oh,
did.
good. Okay. I wasn't sure. I looked it up.
I'm inventing species now. So that's the thing is when you don't get enough species on your Maryland 100 list, you begin to invent them so that you can have more, right? Yeah, Harris's checker spot.
Okay. The second question I had was, when did you encounter the Appalachian tiger? What time in June did you encounter them?
So it depends on where you're going to go. We found them that year on the last weekend in May.
Oh, okay.
And you can find them flying. And so it's a difficult species to figure out in Maryland because it's part of a hybrid swarm that includes probably progeny over eons from Eastern tiger swallowtail and Canadian tiger swallowtail. And Appalachian tiger flies typically at high elevations, beginning around Mother's Day and extending into the middle of July or middle of June. So you have a good month to find them. And you're usually seeing them when in that habitat, that high elevation habitat, you're finding them when Eastern tiger swallowtails are not flying. So that's the distinction. And they're much larger. Once you've seen them, it's hard to tell. It's sort of like downy woodpeckers and hairy woodpeckers. When we say downy woodpecker is so much larger. Well, you just don't know that until you see them side by side. And it's like, oh my God, who'd have thought the hairy woodpeckers are huge? That's the same thing with Appalachian tiger swallowtails. They really are huge. But even good people are not always able to identify them.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is that for years we have encountered the Appalachian tiger in Green Ridge on 15 Mile Creek Road in early June.
Yeah.
And they are certainly very large. Not as large as the
giant
subspecies in Florida, Mainardi, but they're big. And you can, they're pretty regular, I'd say. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I think they're a reliable sighting out there most years. They are hard to tell apart, though.
Yeah.
The The large Appalachian is very distinct from the regular eastern tiger. When you get smaller Appalachians and larger easterns, it's a crapshoot, I will tell you.
Yep.
I see a question from Richard has his hand up.
Hello, good evening. I just have a quick side question, and you seem to be the guy to ask. I've read that painted ladies migrate, and that they migrate even farther than monarchs do. So the first question is that true, or did I just find a fake website? And are there any other butterflies that you know of that migrate and affect what you can see when? Thanks.
Sure. So yes, that is true. Painted lady has the longest migration of any butterfly, but not in North America. This is in Europe. It flies from Sahara all the way up into Scandinavia.
Finland.
It's huge. It is not typically a multi-generational migration the way monarchs are. So, you know, when our monarchs leave Mexico or the Gulf states, where they increasingly are wintering now, when they move, one generation gets them as far as Oklahoma, Kansas, Tennessee. Next generation gets them to Vermont. Next generation gets them into the Maritimes. And then the last generation takes them all the way back to their wintering grounds, whether that's, now we just realized there's a wintering population in the swamps in South Carolina or Florida or Georgia or into Mexico, where the most of the Midwestern butterflies tend to end up. So yes, that's true, but they don't typically migrate then back to the Sahara. Monarchs are about the only butterflies we know who have that whole cycle. It takes them back to their original spot. What happens with painted ladies is that some either stay in the original area, some few of them, and then they erupt and then they migrate north. But very few of them actually are returning back to those wintering grounds in the same way that monarchs do. On the other hand, we have many, many, many butterflies species, more we're discovering every year, that tend to be at least partially migratory. American snout is partially migratory. It tends to migrate up here. If you see them in Texas, like right now, I was telling Matt before the conversation started today, they're erupting right now, or had been when it was a week ago Sunday. It was 80 degrees. I was wearing sunscreen and shorts and t-shirts. And then the next day it was 25 degrees and all the butterflies were dead. But it was a huge eruption. I mean, it was such a huge eruption that when the temperature hit 25 that night, the next morning, all the warblers were on the ground, and you think, why are the warblers on the ground? They were all eating butterflies that had succumbed to the frost in the night and were on the path. And there were so many of them. They were so fat they could barely fly. They were just gorging on those. So that's what's one species. But again, they're not bidirectional. They're only one directional. Now, we're just figuring out that cloudless sulfur, which many of you know as a midsummer and late summer specialty here, comes up from, it doesn't overwinter here, it comes up from the Gulf states in search of senna, mostly for its senna and to some extent some of the other small legumes, to be able to, partridge pea in particular, to be able to survive here, but it doesn't survive the winter. It turns out some of those butterflies actually turn around and go south at the end of the season. They don't all succumb. That's only been worked out in the last decade. And I suspect there are many, many others, particularly skippers, who do the same thing. Because when you're at the shore in the fall, in addition to monarchs going south, you can often have other flights of other things going along the ocean. And the reason they do that there is because the prevailing winds keep them from having to fly very hard. They get to coast on the prevailing winds.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent.
Sure.
I
Fred?
see the next hand is Fred.
So, good evening, Rick. Nice presentation and information. had a comment and a question. So the there we go. The Appalachian tigers, I just wanted to comment that females are much more distinguishable than the males, and you can easily tell one of those, I think. And with enough practice, the males are distinguishable as well. You know, the underside markings, I think, give them away. Sometimes there's some species or specimens, I should say, that are harder to tell apart. But the scallops on the hind wing in glaucus, and then the step ladder hind wing in Appalachiensis help tell them apart. And they've got an intermarginal blue sickle-shaped margin stripe, which I think you know this, but I'm thinking that they're a lot easier to tell apart after you've seen the number of them. And females, of course, being a lot more distinguishable with reduced blue. The black females, they come in black also, of course, like glaucus, and they are sometimes with no blue at all on the hind wings. They're really interesting. I don't know if
Have
you've
you
seen one
actually
like that.
have you actually seen the dark morph female in Maryland?
Yes, I've caught one.
There you go. Right. I knew Bob did. I've seen them in West Virginia, though, not in Maryland.
Yeah.
I have females from Maryland, but not the black ones. And also in West Virginia, you have more opportunities, I think, for some reason there to see these black females. There's an intermediate female too, which are really interesting if you ever see one of those. A lot more scarce, but they are around too.
I
It's just a
think
question of the frequency, gene frequencies, you know. Um,
I think Nick
so
Griffin's work right now suggests that much of what we're seeing is still remnants of a hybrid swarm. So what you say is absolutely true of typical Appalachians and typical glaucus. But I still think there are a lot of specimens that show genetic characteristics of both species, both parent species, which makes identification in the field challenging, not impossible, but challenging.
Yep.
they definitely share genes, and you know it's called hybrid integration. They've been at this since the end of the ice age or so, and as you go northward, you're going to see a gradient of different characteristics. You know, with uh, more outward appearance of glaucus in some cases, or more of Canadian. You know,
Yeah.
but I think you know the information I've gotten is they feel it's a bona fide species that has arisen through the hybrid integration, and um, I find them to be one of the more fascinating uh, butterflies we have. You know,
I
um,
agree.
Fred, did we lose track of your original question? Did you have a question for
I do have a
Rick?
question too, but it
Okay.
was about Edward's hair streak. If you could mention the populations of Edwards that you saw, were they still rather robust, or were they you know sparse? I was just wondering about that. And the ones that Soldiers Delight seem to have disappeared, at least to what I remember. And are you finding these in Western Maryland or what?
The only viable population I know of is in Frederick County. The only one.
Okay.
There are scattered sightings in other parts of the state, but there are no populations as far as I'm aware. This particularly sad issue with the Edwards hair streak at Soldier's Delight. I mean, it gets to what your conservation priorities are. So when the botanists at Soldier's Delight wanted to renovate one of the areas, they cut down a lot of the scrub oak, which of course is the host plant for the caterpillar, with the expectation that the butterflies would then move to the next patch of scrub oak down the transmission line a ways. At the time, I don't think anyone recognized just how dependent Edward's hair streak was on ant crow species. And you
Yeah,
have to have
yeah.
the ant in the same habitat as the butterfly. And without that ant, you're not going to have Edward's hair streak. My concern about the population in Frederick is invasive ants and their impact on the native ant species that the butterflies co-depend on.
Hmm.
It was also,
Definitely.
I mean, many of us have wondered, the area where we see them in Frederick County has almost no nectar. You never find them nectaring. You find them basking on flowers or basking on leaves. You find them basking on the lower limbs of their post oak hosts, but you almost never find them on flowers because in the fields where we find them, there at that time of the year almost no flowers. Turns out that they feed almost exclusively on exudates from plant galls. And that's why they disappear. They come down, they mate, they, lay their eggs on usually small scrub oaks in a regenerated meadow habitat. And then by 10 o'clock, they're back up in the trees. And we always wonder, what the hell? Why the hell did they go back up in the trees? Turns out that's where their nectar source is. They are the galls on the oak trees way high in the canopies. We're finding that's true of king's hair streak and many of the other rare hair streaks as well. But they're actually, the reason they leave and they go up in the canopy at 10, 11 o'clock is they're done being preyed on by dragonflies at eye level. They're back up in the canopies feeding on galls.
Very interesting.
I learned so much from that talk, Rick. I mean, not just about like your personal like intrepidness, but also all of these facts about habitats and where to find all these different species. That was super cool. Thank you so much. I think we need to wrap up because it's a little after 8. Are there any last questions that people would like to share?
Just a comment. It
Yeah,
sounded like quite an odyssey, and
right.
thank you for sharing it with us.
It was terrific. We had a great time and just delighted to share.
Really appreciate you taking the time, Rick. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Good seeing so many familiar faces and names here as well.
All right.
Thanks, Rick.
Thanks,
Take
Matt.
care,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
See you next time.